The sand of the Zephyrian expanse didn't just blow. It screamed. It was a fine, rust-colored powder that found its way into every crevice of Corporal Finn Rourke's gear. His boots, and he was certain, his very soul. He'd been on a dozen postings before this one, from the ice mines of Ceres to the orbital docks of Luna, but Fort Solitude was something else entirely. It wasn't just a desert base. It was a monument to human stubbornness, a cluster of Durasteel domes and landing pads clinging to the edge of a vast, empty sea of dunes under a sky so brutally blue it felt like a physical weight. Finn was tired. Bone-tired. The war against the Cathar hegemony had been grinding on for 7 years. A brutal, sprawling conflict that had chewed up entire battalions and spat out ghosts. He'd seen friends vaporized by plasma fire and others slowly go mad from the isolation of deep space patrols. He'd requested this assignment not for glory, but for quiet. A place to lick his wounds, both physical and mental, far from the front lines. He'd expected solitude, maybe a few grizzled veterans to share a drink with, and the simple, monotonous task of monitoring long-range sensors for any sign of enemy activity. What he got was a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a mystery. His commanding officer, Major Vance, was a man whose face seemed permanently set in a frown, as if the universe itself had personally offended him. He'd barely looked up from his datapad when Finn reported for duty. "Rourke," he'd grunted, his voice like gravel in a tin can. "You're late." "I was on schedule, sir," Finn had replied, his own voice rough from the dry air. "Your transport was scheduled to arrive at 0800. It was 0803. That's late." Vance finally looked up, his eyes sharp and assessing. "We run a tight ship here, Corporal. Or we try to, anyway. Your quarters are in Dome Gamma. You'll be assigned to the long-range reconnaissance team. Standard sensor sweeps, perimeter patrols. Nothing fancy. Just don't get yourself killed out there. We're short on bodies as it is." Finn had nodded, relieved. Simple, boring work. Exactly what he needed. He'd spent the next 2 days settling in, cleaning his gear, and trying to ignore the constant low-grade hum of the base's life support systems. He'd even managed to share a silent meal with a few other soldiers, their faces etched with the same weary resignation he felt. This was it, his quiet corner of the galaxy. Then, on the third morning, everything changed. He was summoned back to Major Vance's office. This time, the Major wasn't alone. Standing beside his desk was a figure who made Finn's breath catch in his throat. She was tall, nearly his own height, with a lithe, athletic build that spoke of grace and power in equal measure. Her skin was a vibrant, healthy green, the color of new leaves in spring, and her hair was a cascade of fiery orange that seemed to defy the dull, dusty palette of the base. It was tied back in a complex braid that fell past her shoulders, but a few rebellious strands framed a face of striking, alien beauty. Her eyes were large and almond-shaped, a deep, intelligent amber that held an ocean of unspoken emotion. She wore a form-fitting flight suit of a dark, non-reflective material, its only adornment a small silver insignia on her chest, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. "Corporal Rourke," Vance said, his tone devoid of its usual irritation, replaced by something that sounded almost like apprehension. "This is Lyra. She's your new partner." Finn blinked. "My partner, sir?" "For your next mission," Vance clarified, his gaze flicking between Finn and the alien woman. "A joint operation. Human Alliance and the Sylphian Concordance. You've heard of them?" Finn had. Everyone had. The Sylphians were a reclusive, ancient species who had only recently joined the war on humanity's side. Their technology was generations ahead of anything the Alliance possessed, particularly in the fields of stealth and energy manipulation. They were also famously private, their culture a labyrinth of unspoken rules and subtle social cues that humans often failed to navigate. To be assigned a Sylphian partner was unheard of. It was a privilege, a massive responsibility, and, frankly, terrifying. Lyra stepped forward, her movements fluid and silent. She offered a small, formal bow, her amber eyes meeting his directly. "I am honored to serve with you, Corporal Rourke," she said. Her voice was melodic, with a slight, musical lilt that was utterly captivating. It was nothing like the harsh, guttural sounds he'd expected from an alien. Finn, feeling clumsy and awkward, managed a stiff nod. "The honor is mine, Lyra." Vance cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange. "Your mission is classified, level Sigma. You'll be briefed in the secure briefing room in 1 hour." Dismissed. He turned back to his datapad, effectively ending the conversation. For the next hour, Finn's mind raced. He tried to recall everything he'd ever read about the Scythians. They were telepathic, or so the rumors went, though they rarely used it with outsiders. They valued silence, patience, and a deep connection to their environment. They were also fiercely loyal once that loyalty was earned. He had no idea how to earn it. He was just a grunt, a soldier who followed orders and tried to stay alive. He wasn't a diplomat or a scholar. When he arrived at the secure briefing room, Lyra was already there, standing by the holodeck, her expression unreadable. The room was sterile and cold, the only light coming from the projector in the center of the table. As Finn entered, the door hissed shut behind him, and the projector flared to life, casting a three-dimensional map of the Zephyrian expanse onto the table. The Cthar have established a forward listening post. A synthesized voice announced, its tone flat and emotionless. A red dot appeared on the map, deep in the heart of the most treacherous dune sea, a region known as the Shattered Wastes. Their new sensor array is capable of detecting our fleet movements across 3 sectors. It must be neutralized. The mission parameters were straightforward, yet suicidal. They were to infiltrate the Cthar outpost, plant a series of EMP charges on the primary array, and exfiltrate before the entire base went on high alert. The catch was the insertion point. Their dropship would be too vulnerable to fly directly over the target. They would have to land 50 clicks out and traverse the Shattered Wastes on foot. 50 kilometers of razor-sharp silica shards, unpredictable sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, and native predators known as skitterers, 6-legged, chitinous horrors that hunted in packs. It was a death sentence, and he was supposed to do it with an alien he'd just met. The Scythian Concordance has provided a cloaking device, the voice continued. A schematic of a small, disc-shaped object appeared on the table. It will mask your biosignatures from Cthar sensors. However, it has a limited power supply and is ineffective against visual detection. You will rely on stealth and terrain. Lyra finally spoke, her voice calm and focused. The Shattered Wastes are not just a physical challenge, Corporal. The sands there are saturated with residual psychic energy from an ancient Scythian battle. It can play tricks on the mind, can make you see things that aren't there, hear voices from your past. You must maintain your focus. Finn swallowed hard. Great. Not only did he have to worry about being eaten or sandblasted, now he had to worry about going crazy. Understood, he managed to say. Their gear was minimal. Lightweight armor, water recyclers, rations for 3 days, their sidearms, and the precious cloaking device, which Lyra took possession of with a reverence that suggested it was more than just a piece of tech. They were given a single, heavily modified speeder bike for the first leg of their journey, its engine muffled to a whisper. The ride into the wastes was a blur of wind, dust, and tension. Finn drove, his eyes fixed on the navigation screen, while Lyra sat behind him, her presence a quiet, steady weight against his back. He could feel her watching the horizon, her senses seemingly attuned to the desert in a way his own never could be. She didn't speak, but her silence wasn't empty. It was full of a watchful intensity that was both unnerving and reassuring. They abandoned the speeder bike at the edge of the true wastes, where the ground became a jagged, glassy plain that would tear the vehicle's treads to shreds. From here on, it was on foot. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on them, and the air was so dry it felt like it was sucking the moisture from their lungs with every breath. Finn's armor, designed for cooler climates, quickly became a sauna. He could feel sweat stinging his eyes, his muscles aching with every step. Lyra, however, moved with an effortless grace. Her green skin seemed to absorb the heat rather than suffer from it, and her breathing was slow and steady. She pointed out safe paths through the razor fields, her knowledge of the terrain uncanny. At one point, she stopped him just as he was about to step onto a patch of sand that looked solid. With a subtle gesture, she showed him the faint, almost invisible tremor in the ground, a sign of a sinkhole of quicksand beneath. He owed her his life before they'd even seen the enemy as the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. They found a shallow cave in the lee of a massive rock formation. They ate their rations in silence, the only sound the soft crunch of the nutrient paste and the distant howl of the wind. Finn was exhausted, his body screaming for rest, but his mind was too wired. He kept thinking about the mission, about the Cthar, about the strange, beautiful alien sitting across from him. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra looked up, her amber eyes reflecting the last of the dying light. "Why you for what, Corporal?" "For this mission. For you. I'm just a regular soldier. There are officers, specialists, people who know how to talk to aliens." A faint, Almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. My people do not choose partners based on rank or title. We choose them based on their spirit. Major Vance's file on you mentioned your actions on the moon of Viridian Prime. You held your position for 3 days against overwhelming odds, protecting a civilian evacuation convoy. You did not retreat, even when your own squad was down to half its strength. You showed a resilience, a quiet courage that is rare. My superiors believed you would be a worthy companion for this task. Finn was stunned. He'd never thought of that battle as anything special. It was just his job. He'd done what he had to do. I just didn't want anyone else to die, he said simply. That is the most important reason of all, Lyra replied softly. That night, as they took turns on watch, the psychic energy of the wastes began to seep into Finn's consciousness. He saw flashes of his old squad, their faces twisted in pain, heard their voices calling his name from the darkness. He saw his home planet, a green and blue jewel he hadn't visited in 10 years, and felt a pang of homesickness so sharp it was physical. He fought to keep his mind anchored in the present, focusing on the sound of Lyra's steady breathing, the feel of the cool rock beneath his hand that in the middle of his watch. A sandstorm rolled in, a wall of dust and grit that blotted out the stars. They huddled deeper into the cave, the wind screaming like a banshee outside. In the oppressive darkness, cut off from the world, Finn felt a strange sense of intimacy. He and Lyra were 2 tiny specks of life in a vast, hostile universe, bound together by a shared purpose. Do your people have stories about places like this? He asked, his voice barely a whisper over the storm. Lyra was silent for a long moment. We have a story about the first silence, she said finally. After our world was born, it was filled with noise, the roar of volcanoes, the crash of oceans, the cries of newborn life. But then, for one single day, all sounds ceased. The world held its breath. In that silence, the first Sylthians learned to listen, not with their ears, but with their hearts. They learned to hear the song of the planet itself, the slow, deep rhythm of its core. The shattered wastes are a place of broken silence. The song is there, but it is fractured, painful. It is a reminder that even in the most desolate places, there is a story to be heard, if you are willing to listen. Finn didn't fully understand, but he felt the truth of her words in his bones. He closed his eyes and tried to listen, not to the storm, but to the deep, quiet hum beneath it. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The next day, they reached the outskirts of the Kthar outpost. It was a squat, ugly structure of black metal, built into the side of a canyon wall. Guard towers bristled with automated turrets, and patrol drones buzzed through the air like angry insects. It was a fortress, and they were 2 mice trying to sneak inside. Lyra activated the cloaking device. A shimmering field of distorted light enveloped them, and their biosignatures vanished from his helmet's HUD. Stay close, she whispered, her voice right in his ear. The field is small, and remember, it won't hide our footprints. They moved like ghosts, sticking to the shadows, using the natural contours of the canyon to mask their approach. Lyra's knowledge of stealth was masterful. She knew exactly when to move, when to freeze, how to time their movements with the patrol patterns of the drones. Finn followed her lead, his heart pounding in his chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his pulse rifle. They reached the main entrance, a heavy blast door guarded by 2 hulking Kthar sentries. The Kthar were reptilian humanoids, their scales a dull, muddy brown, their eyes glowing red slits in their armored helmets. They stood perfectly still, their massive weapons held across their chests. Lyra pointed to a ventilation shaft high on the wall. It was their only way in. Finn looked at the smooth rock face, then at her. How? She gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and challenge. You are a soldier of the Human Alliance. You find a way. He sighed. Of course. He scanned the area, looking for handholds, for anything he could use. He spotted a series of narrow ledges, almost invisible in the gloom. It would be a difficult climb, and one slip would mean a very loud, very final end to their mission. He took a deep breath, checked his grip on his rifle, and began to climb. The rock was rough and unforgiving, scraping his hands and knees. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Below him, Lyra watched, her expression unreadable. Halfway up, his foot slipped on a loose stone. He scrambled for a hold, his heart leaping into his throat, but his fingers found a crack in the rock. He hung there for a moment, suspended over a 50-foot drop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he felt a hand on his back, steadying him. He looked up to see Lyra, who had somehow scaled the wall in complete silence, right behind him. She hadn't made a sound. She just gave him a small, encouraging nod, and he continued his climb, his fear replaced by a fierce determination. They slipped into the ventilation shaft, crawling through the tight, dark space for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with the smell of oil and ozone. Finally, they emerged into a maintenance corridor. The interior of the base was a maze of pipes, conduits, and flickering lights. The low thrum of machinery vibrated through the floor. Their target was the central control room, where the sensor array's main power conduit was located. Lyra led the way, her senses seemingly able to detect the presence of guards through the walls. They avoided patrols with inches to spare, their hearts hammering in their chests. At one point, they had to hide in a storage closet as a group of Cthar engineers walked past, their guttural language echoing in the corridor. Finally, they reached the control room. It was a large circular chamber filled with banks of humming consoles and a massive crystalline structure in the center, the heart of the sensor array. 2 Cthar technicians were working at a console, their backs to the door. Finn and Lyra exchanged a look. This was it. They had to move fast. Lyra drew a slender, needle-like blade from her boot, while Finn raised his rifle. On a silent count of 3, they burst into the room. The fight was over in seconds. Lyra moved with a speed and precision that was terrifyingly beautiful. Her blade found the gaps in the Cthar's armor with lethal accuracy. Finn's pulse rifle barked twice, the concussive rounds dropping the second technician before he could raise the alarm. The room was silent again, save for their own heavy breathing. "Hurry," Lyra urged, already moving towards the central conduit. Finn pulled the EMP charges from his pack and began to attach them to the power couplings. The timer was set for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to get out of the base before it was plunged into darkness and chaos. They were halfway back to the ventilation shaft when the alarm started to blare. A shrill, deafening sound that echoed through the entire base. Red lights flashed, casting the corridors in a hellish glow. "They must have a backup system," Finn yelled over the din. "We've been made! Run!" Lyra shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. They sprinted down the corridor, their boots slamming on the metal floor. Behind them, they could hear the heavy thud of approaching Cthar boots and the whine of charging weapons. A hail of plasma bolts sizzled past them, scorching the walls. Finn returned fire, his shots buying them precious seconds. They reached the ventilation shaft and scrambled inside just as a squad of Cthar rounded the corner. The shaft was too narrow for their large frames, but they opened fire anyway, the plasma bolts melting the metal around the entrance. "We can't go back the way we came," Finn gasped as they crawled away from the entrance. "They'll be waiting for us outside." Lyra's mind was racing. "There's another way out. The waste disposal chute. It leads to the canyon floor." "The waste disposal chute? Are you insane? We'll be crushed. It's our only chance," she insisted, her amber eyes blazing with determination. "Trust me, Finn." He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering resolve in her face, and he knew he had no choice. He trusted her. "Lead the way." They navigated the maze of vents, the alarms growing louder and more frantic as the EMP timer counted down. They found the waste chute, a large cylindrical tube that dropped straight down into darkness. The smell was overwhelming. "On my mark," Lyra said, pulling a small device from her belt. "This will create a temporary energy field to cushion our fall. It will only last for 3 seconds. We jumped together." Finn nodded, his stomach churning. This was either the bravest or the stupidest thing he'd ever done. He grabbed her hand, and for a moment, their eyes locked. In that instant he saw not just an alien, but a partner, a friend. He saw the same fear he felt in his own heart, but also a courage that dwarfed his own. "Now!" she cried. They jumped into the abyss. The world became a blur of darkness and rushing air. Finn's stomach lurched into his throat. Then, just as they were about to hit the bottom, a soft, blue light enveloped them, and they landed with a gentle thud on a pile of organic sludge. They didn't have time to be disgusted. They scrambled to their feet and ran, bursting out of a hidden exit at the base of the canyon wall. Behind them, the Cthar outpost was a chaotic mess of flashing lights and panicked shouts. They could see the searchlights sweeping the canyon, looking for them. They ran for their lives, heading for the rendezvous point where their extraction ship would be waiting. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty. They were exposed, vulnerable. Plasma bolts began to rain down around them, kicking up plumes of sand. Finn's legs burned, his lungs on fire. He could feel Lyra's hand in his, pulling him forward, her strength lending him her own. He could see the extraction ship in the distance, its engines glowing, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. They were so close. Then, a bolt of plasma struck the ground right in front of them, throwing them both off their feet. Finn landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. He looked up to see a Kthar gunship hovering overhead, its weapons trained on them. Lyra was on her feet in an instant, shoving him behind a large rock. "Get to the ship!" she yelled, her voice raw with desperation. "I'll hold them off." "No!" Finn shouted, grabbing her arm. "We go together. There's no time," she insisted. Her eyes filled with a fierce, protective love he hadn't realized was there until this very moment. "Go! That's an order." Before he could argue, she turned and ran in the opposite direction, drawing the gunship's fire. Finn watched in horror as she dodged and weaved, a lone green and orange figure against the overwhelming might of the enemy. He wanted to run after her, to fight beside her, but he knew she was right. If he didn't make it to the ship, her sacrifice would be for nothing. With a final, agonizing look back at her, he turned and ran towards the extraction ship, his heart breaking with every step. The ship's ramp was down, and a crewman was waving frantically at him. He could hear the roar of the gunship's engines, the sizzle of plasma bolts, and somewhere in the chaos, he thought he heard Lyra's voice, singing a soft, sad Scythian song. He stumbled up the ramp, collapsing onto the deck as the ship lifted off. He scrambled to the viewport, his eyes searching the battlefield below. He saw the Kthar gunship hovering over the spot where Lyra had been. He saw a flash of green, a final, defiant burst of energy, and then nothing. The ship climbed higher, leaving the burning outpost and the desolate canyon behind. Finn sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands. He had completed the mission. The sensor array was destroyed, but he had lost his partner, his friend. He had lost Lyra. The journey back to Fort Solitude was a blur of grief and guilt. He reported to Major Vance, giving a terse, factual account of the mission. He omitted the part about Lyra's sacrifice, unable to put it into words. Vance just nodded, his face grim. "Good work, Rourke. Get some rest." But rest was impossible. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lyra's face, heard her voice, felt her hand in his as they ran for their lives. He felt a profound emptiness, a hole in his chest where his heart used to be. He had come to Fort Solitude seeking peace, and instead, he had found a connection so deep and so sudden that its loss was unbearable. He spent his days wandering the base, a ghost among men. He avoided the other soldiers, their cheerful banter a painful reminder of the camaraderie he'd lost. He would often go to the observation deck, staring out at the endless sea of dunes, wondering if somewhere out there, in the vast, silent expanse, Lyra's spirit was still singing her song. One evening, as the twin moons of Zephyria rose in the sky, casting long silver shadows across the desert, Finn was on the observation deck, lost in his thoughts. He was so deep in his grief that he didn't hear the soft footsteps behind him. Corporal Rourke. The voice was soft, melodic, and achingly familiar. He froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He turned slowly, afraid that if he moved too fast, the illusion would shatter. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the moonlight, was Lyra. She was battered and bruised, her flight suit torn and stained, but she was alive. Her amber eyes were wide with exhaustion and relief, and a tentative smile played on her lips. Finn couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just stared at her, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes were seeing. He took a shaky step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out a trembling hand, touching her cheek, needing to feel the solid reality of her. You're alive," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra covered his hand with her own, her touch warm and real. "The Scythian song is not so easily silenced, Finn," she said softly. "I told you I would hold them off. I did not say I would not return." A sob escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he could fuse her back into his soul. She clung to him just as fiercely, her body shaking with the aftershocks of her ordeal. And that moment, on the edge of the screaming desert, surrounded by the quiet song of the twin moons, Finn Rourke realized that his search for peace was over. He had found it not in solitude, but in the fierce, unwavering heart of a green-skinned, orange-haired alien warrior who had risked everything to save him. Their mission was over, but their story was just beginning. A new chapter written in the silent, starlit language of a bond forged in the fires of war and tempered by the quiet courage of the desert. The days that followed Lyra's return were a blur of quiet healing and unspoken understanding. The base's medics tended to her wounds, but it was Finn who stayed by her side, bringing her water, sharing his rations, and simply sitting in the comfortable silence that had become their shared language. He learned the details of her escape, how she'd used a discarded Cthar power cell to overload a nearby fuel depot, creating a diversion that allowed her to slip away into the labyrinthine canyons. She'd walked for 2 days with no food and little water, guided only by the stars and the faint, psychic echo of their connection. A thread she refused to let break Major Vance. For all his gruffness, was a man of discretion. He filed a report that credited their success to a joint tactical maneuver and listed Lyra as Kia in action, a necessary fiction to protect the Silthian Concordance's involvement. In private, he gave Finn a rare, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "You two are a hell of a team, Rourke. Don't waste it." As Lyra recovered, a new dynamic settled between them. The formal titles of corporal and partner fell away, replaced by just their names. They would often sit on the observation deck at night, watching the twin moons cast their silver light over the desert. Finn told her about his home, a small coastal town on Earth where the air smelled of salt and pine. Lyra, in turn, spoke of her world, Siltha, a planet of vast, silent forests and crystalline oceans, where the cities grew from living trees and history was sung, not written. She told him of the Silthian custom of the heart's bond, a commitment far deeper than human marriage, a lifelong vow where two souls pledged to walk the same path, to share in each other's joys and sorrows until the end of their days. It was a bond entered into only after a trial of fire, a shared experience that proved their spirits were truly intertwined. "The shattered wastes were our trial," she said one evening, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight. "And the Cthar outpost was our fire. We have passed it, Finn." He knew what she was asking. He looked at her. The vibrant green of her skin, the fiery orange of her hair, the quiet strength in her gaze, and he knew his answer without a moment's hesitation. He took her hand, the same hand that had pulled him from the abyss, and held it tightly. "My path is yours, Lyra, for as long as you'll have me." Her smile was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, a sunrise breaking over the dunes. In the Silthian way, there was no grand ceremony, no rings or vows spoken before a crowd. Their bond was sealed in that quiet moment, under the watchful eyes of the Zephyrian stars, a promise made not with words, but with the simple, profound truth in their hearts. Their next assignment came not from Major Vance, but from a high-ranking Silthian envoy who arrived at Fort Solitude in a ship of shimmering organic metal. The war was changing. The destruction of the Cthar listening post had been a critical blow, and the Alliance needed more joint operations. Finn and Lyra were requested, no, demanded, as a permanent team. Their unique blend of human tenacity and Silthian grace had proven to be an unstoppable force. They left Fort Solitude together, not as a soldier and his alien companion, but as partners, as equals, as something more. Their new mission was to establish a forward liaison post on a neutral world, a place where human and Silthian forces could learn to fight as one. It was a daunting task, a bridge between two vastly different cultures. But they were ready years later, on a peaceful world far from the screaming sands of Zephyria. A small house stood on the edge of a forest that sang with the same quiet song Lyra had once described. The house was a blend of human practicality and Silthian artistry, its walls woven from living wood and reinforced with dur steel. In the garden, a young boy with green-tinged skin and a shock of bright orange hair chased a small, six-legged creature that looked suspiciously like a domesticated skitterer. Inside, a girl with Finn's dark hair and Lyra's intelligent amber eyes was carefully tending to a terrarium of glowing Zephyrian moss. Finn, his face now lined with age and laughter, watched them from the porch, a cup of steaming tea in his hands. Lyra came to stand beside him, her presence as steady and comforting as the ground beneath their feet. They had built a life here, a family born from the ashes of war. They had faced countless battles since that day in the desert, but they had faced them together. They had taught their children the value of courage, of compassion, and of the quiet strength found in a shared silence. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched their children play, their future unfolding in the golden afternoon light. The war had given them a beginning forged in fire, but their love had built an ending of profound and lasting peace. They had found their quiet corner of the galaxy, not in solitude, but in the heart of a family they had created together, a perfect, satisfying harmony of two worlds, two souls, forever bound as one. Their life on the quiet world of Ethel was the peaceful epilogue their wartime saga deserved. The house they built together stood as a testament to their union, its architecture a seamless blend of human ingenuity and Sylthian organic harmony. Its walls, woven from living, silverbark trees native to Lyra's homeworld, breathed with the seasons, while its sturdy frame and solar collectors were a nod to Finn's practical earth-born nature. It was more than a home. It was a sanctuary they had earned. Their days settled into a gentle, fulfilling rhythm. Mornings were for tending their garden, a vibrant patch of land where Terran vegetables grew alongside glowing Sylthian flora, a small, personal symbol of their two worlds thriving as one. Finn, his soldier's hands now skilled in cultivation, would often be found repairing a fence or teaching their son, Kalen, how to track the harmless, six-legged forest dwellers. Lyra, her fiery orange hair often tied back in a simple braid, would be inside, her melodic voice reading ancient Sylthian star charts to their daughter Ilara, or preparing a meal that blended the spicy herbs of her people with the comforting stews of Finn's childhood. The ghosts of war never fully left them, but they no longer held power over their present. On clear nights, they would sit on their porch, just as they had on Fort Solitude, but now with their children nestled between them. They would point out constellations, Finn showing them the familiar shapes of the Terran sky, and Lyra weaving in the older, deeper stories of the Sylthian celestial map. Their shared past was a foundation, not a shadow. They were known throughout their small, mixed-species community not as the legendary war heroes who had destroyed the Cthar array, but simply as Finn and Lyra, the kind neighbors, the loving parents, the couple whose bond was a quiet, steady force. Their love had matured from the desperate, fiery connection forged in the desert into something deep, calm, and unshakable, like the roots of the great trees surrounding their home. Years turned into decades. Their children grew, strong and confident, inheritors of a unique legacy of courage and compassion. Kalen, with his mother's grace and his father's determination, became an explorer, charting new, peaceful trade routes between worlds. Ilara, possessing her father's analytical mind and her mother's empathetic soul, became a xenobiologist, dedicated to understanding and preserving the fragile ecosystems of 1,000 planets. Finn and Lyra watched them go with pride, their hearts full.